Спасибо.
Well, greeting everybody, and welcome to the second lecture in the Rise and Fall of Complex Society. What's that? Okay. Lecture 2 of the Rise and Fall of Complex Societies. And in this lecture, we'll continue where we left off last time, talking about how we define complex societies, how we define civilizations, and then we'll talk about the processes associated with the evolution of complex societies. So again, I'm Jay Silverstein, professor here at the School for Advanced Studies at the University of UTMN. This course will be taught as a Zoom course to the regular students from the SAS, as well as an open course that is broadcast on YouTube streaming. If you have questions, for those of you who are in the Zoom class, feel free to ask the questions either in the chat or to raise your hand and I can open up your mic, or you can open up your mic. And for those of you who are watching from the open course on YouTube streaming, you can send a message through the chat and that'll be relayed to me, and then I would be able to answer that. So, any questions before we get going? Anything from last time? Good. I can make this all work. Okay, can you all see the screen okay?
Yes.
All right. You never quite know on this end. So I do have 2 monitors, so I've got them both working now. So after the technical issues last time. So we left off on Tuesday talking about the criteria of civilization by various scholars. And we left off with Murdoch doing an analysis similar to V. Gordon Child's analysis, where he was looking at a series of characteristics that he thought were defining characteristics of a society, and that he could rate them, score those characteristics, and therefore get an estimate, a model of what were the most complex societies. So Nikolai Creighton took that same data, modified it a little bit, and tried to do some statistical analysis to see what factors were cross-correlating and what were the most essential, the principal elements associated with complex societies in the higher levels of civilization. So the 10 criteria that he used for his analysis were writing and records, fixity of residence, agriculture, urbanization, technological specialization, land transport, money, population density, political integration, and social stratification. Now you notice there's something missing there. He omitted monumental architecture. He could see enough examples in archaeological societies that we knew to know that there were a lot of societies that didn't have complex societies or highly complex societies, yet were involved in building monuments, such as the ancient British who built Stonehenge, or the Polynesians on Easter Island who built the giant statues, the moai. So he was saying, look, if these people, I know they're not centralized, and yet they have these impressive monuments, it must not be a characteristic that I can use to judge whether somebody's, it's a requirement for a complex society, or or not. So he omitted that as a criteria. Any thoughts on that as far as him omitting that? Does that seem reasonable in view of the evidence he was seeing in the archaeological record? Anybody have a thought on that? All right, save it. So when he ran his correlations, he saw that there were some things that showed very strong correlations. So if you look at residence, for instance, and agriculture had a very strong correlation. Also residence, agriculture, and population were quite strong. Political integration and social stratification, also quite strong. Most everything else seemed to fall either in some things that were very low correlations or in the mid-range where they weren't that strong, around 5. So he was able to draw a few conclusions by doing this statistical analysis, this correlation of the various attributes of civilization. One thing is he determined that there are not any universal attributes of the state system and civilization. Writing, urbanization, monumental architecture, any of the other criterion are not obligatory characteristics of a complex society. So that while you might have a bunch of these, you may not have some of them also. So there wasn't one thing that was just defining this is a complex society of these attributes that they were using. He noticed that the development of social stratification occurs in parallel with political integration. Okay, I don't think that's particularly surprising. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we get to the end of his conclusions. He determined that for creating a developed stratified society with 3 classes, so again looking at this social stratification, the permanent residence agriculture as the basis of economy, extensive agriculture as the rule, as well as various trades, metalworking, are necessary. So they have to have this base level of economy and developed economy and craft specialization. So those he saw as being important if you're going to have a stratified society. So as you think about that, I mean, again, it makes sense because if you're going to have levels of people within a society, it means they have to have differential wealth. Differential wealth means that some people are getting more agricultural products or they're producing other goods. So there's a surplus that some people can accumulate more than other people, and thus creating these levels of stratification, of social and economic stratification. He concluded that multi-level political integration does not suggest such strict correlations. He sees it testifying that the 3-level class structure, the social stratification, is more reliable of a criteria for evaluating the degree of complexity than was the political stratification. And that's a little bit surprising in some ways, I think. And then finally, he concludes, we cannot suppose that developed class structure, permanent residence, agriculture as a base of economy, and metallurgy, or we can suppose that these factors are obligatory, but by themselves inadequate in archaeological criteria for evaluating societies at the highest complexities, civilization. And again, you have to think of this in terms of the type of data that you can collect on a dead civilization through archaeology. All right. In view of the method that he used and those results, do you see any concerns about Creighton's conclusions? Anybody in the class?
Yeah, maybe he said that this can be connected only to those nations or societies which were analyzed by, sorry, I forgot the name,
Murdoch?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah, but it was quite a number of societies. So I think he had 186 societies that he used the analysis on. So yeah, there is some limitation. There's some bias in the data by collecting from societies that you have data on. Obviously, there's a lot of societies that we just don't have enough information to be able to fill in the blanks. So yeah, there is a data bias in there. I don't think that's the strongest factor. Not my major concern when I look at his data. About anything else? How about the system that he uses for scoring the civilizations, or the attributes of the civilizations, using a 0 to 4 scale? How accurate is that? It's a reduction, right, of reality. It's not a hard quantification. It's not looking at agriculture and saying, you're producing per capita, 10,000 kilocalories of food every year per person in that civilization. So there's not a rating like that, a hard, fast number. He just says intensive agriculture. So there's a difference, a high level of subjectivity when you're using that type of scoring. Sometimes it's the best you can do for a system, but sometimes you can find different ways to quantify things with harder data that are more accurate.
So then we say that the research of Murdoch was also not very close to reality, or?
Well, I would say that it would be easy to find problems with it. If you want to go back through it and create it a different scale, that you might find similar results using different variables that might contradict his variables because of the subjective nature and the reductionist nature of how he's having to score those attributes. Another problem that I see is that a lot of these things, he's trying to parse out things that are really very closely related, such as intensive agriculture and permanent residence. If you have farms, people tend to live by them. So these two things are so strongly correlated, and they show up correlated in his data, which is good. But are they really separate variables in some ways, or are they so closely correlated that you're just measuring the same thing by, or something almost the same thing by just a slight variation in name? And so you're creating these strong correlations that will pull your data in different ways based on variables that are not independent of each other, that they're fully codependent. Social stratification and political integration, those things also could be very closely related, and it could be, you could call it one, or maybe you could call it the other when you're looking at different societies. So that codependence, I think, is something, and he deals with it in his conclusions a little bit, but it also shows in his data. We talked about that. And then we talked also that the archaeological data is often incomplete, for a lot of these societies. And so sometimes archaeologists' impression of what they're seeing and how you might score it are biased by the archaeological data that you happen to dig up. If I happen to dig up, the one rich person who, knew somebody from a different civilization who traded them some things, but he wasn't representative of the civilization as a whole, it might skew my interpretation of how complex that society was based on one guy who happened to, know somebody or find something or capture something in a raid that make him look like he was socially more important than other people. And it could just be an accident of the archaeology. So there was another school of anthropological thought, of archaeology, that was looking for much harder ways of understanding and measuring civilization. One of the leaders of this was Leslie White. So he had one of the founders of a school of thought that had to deal with evolution, called neo-evolution, but it applied to culture as well as to other evolutionary ideas. But specifically, he was looking at how do cultures evolve and how can we measure it. So he saw energy of a culture as a fundamental property that was measurable, a way to test how a culture is functioning, at what level culture is functioning. So ultimately, where does energy come from? Most of it comes from the sun, right? So plants are going to turn it into food that is consumed by animals or consumed by people. And so we are machines within a system that process and control energy. And it can be measured in the food that we consume, in the chemicals, the carbon compounds that we burn, and in more advanced societies, there are other ways to get nuclear energy and wave energy, things like that. But the majority of life, the majority of civilizations that have been on Earth have been dependent on energy ultimately derived from the sun, turned into energy through photosynthesis with plants. So, working on that, White saw that societies had, as they got more complex, they had increasing energy capture capacity per person, so per capita, that they were able to manipulate, to collect and manage more energy than societies that were less complex. So associated with that management of energy is the material and social culture. So he sees that if the more energy you're managing, that's correlating with the amount of things you have and the complexity of your culture in organizing itself. And that by controlling that energy, you're increasing your stability, your ability to predict and be secure in the future, to know that you're going to have food tomorrow and next week and next month, because you're a master at harnessing that energy, of knowing the agricultural cycle, knowing when you can get the food, how you can get it, how you can store it. So the more energy that you're managing, he's seeing this also correlating with this increased stability of a society. And of course, stability is important. You can't really have complexity if your society keeps collapsing, every 6 months. So he viewed culture in terms of this evolutionary capacity, and he referred to culture as an extrasomatic means of evolution. In other words, it was a way for us to be successful as a species outside our bodies, outside our genes, that by having culture, we were able to be more efficient, more utilitarian in our ability to work with our environment and survive in it. So, again, for Leslie White and the neo-evolutionist view, the control of energy was key, and this was, of course, driven by technology. And the better your technology, the better your culture, the better you were at harnessing greater amounts of energy. So something that he called it White's law, or was called White's law, a thermodynamic law, that he came up with, was that energy captured with technology would equal culture. And so he's taking something that is actually measurable, the amount of energy a culture has, and using that to score and rate the complexity of a civilization. Again, as we tend to form scales, he sees the stages of evolution, the invention of tools, the domestication of plants and animals, the use of fossil fuels, and then, again, I'm writing in the 1950s, atomic energy as the key measure of the sort of the epitome, the high point of civilization, and being able to master this massive amount of energy. So if you look at different societies, here at the far left, the very bottom there, you see, Paleolithic foragers, running around 2,000 kilocalories of food or of energy being harnessed. And you see how this goes up as you move through hunter and gatherers, early agriculturalists, advanced agriculturalists, industrial societies, and then post-industrial societies, the nuclear society, post-World War II of the 20th century. And of course, you can see that the scale of increase of energy consumption is enormous. We throw out at you, do you see any problems with using energy as a scale for social complexity?
Yes, maybe it depends on the climate of country as well. For instance, you have to heat your car more actively, or your home, and so on.
Okay, so there's a greater demand in different climates for keeping warm during the winter, or whatever it may be, for building shelter, that you might have to use more energy, and that people might adapt their behavior and increase their energy consumption and manipulation in order to adapt to specific stresses within the environment, if I understand you right?
Yes.
Okay.
Maybe I have an assumption that, for example, when civilization don't really have a lot of resources and high quality of technologies, but have a lot of low quality of technologies, like a lot of human or animal power, and this civilization, for example, don't need create a new technology to get to achieve some targets, like ancient Egypt. This is a great civilization, but they most use like animal and human power.
Okay, but that's kind of his point, I think, is that because the measure is per capita, it's per person, so it sort of takes that into account.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not. As he's measuring it here, we're looking at per person expenditure. So it's not just the number of people using the energy and what the total energy consumption is, but it's regulated by the number of people in the society, so that it can be an even scale to take into account just your concern there.
Okay.
And also, I can suppose that the question is also in efficiency of using energy. For example, some more advanced like industry tools, like more advanced industry like devices, they can consume less energy than less advanced. So, and through through the process of growth of complexity of the civilization, it can in some way reduce its consumption of energy through achieving more efficiency. So
yeah, no, that's a very good point. Is that you could be more advanced and therefore more efficient and therefore using less energy. One of the goals of our society now is to figure out how to use less energy, right? And that we would be more efficient and more advanced if we were more efficient at using that energy and therefore having less environmental impact for the energy that we do expend.
Also, Jay, maybe it also can influence, because right now I don't know how to measure which society exactly use this energy, because for instance some America or Canada, they put their industries in other countries like China, for instance.
Oh, yeah. No, and when you consider the global situation and a theory that, if we have time, maybe we'll talk about in the next week or so, Wallerstein's world systems theory. As you move into a world system and you have this complex, interconnected economic system, that it certainly changes a lot of those dynamics, that you can put your requirement for energy on another culture. We can have China make things for us, spend all that energy, and then we just purchase it with money that we own through perhaps other means that did not require as much energy. So world system completely starts to garble if you start to look at different elements of the Earth. Once you get to the world system, maybe we start to lose some of the concepts of there being individual civilizations. Maybe we have to view the world as a civilization because we're so interconnected at a certain point, just like the virus doesn't care about international boundaries and nation states. How the different nation states respond, though, is still something that could be measured. But globalization certainly, Wesley, changes the dynamics of that. Or was that Askia who said that?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so there's problems, and of course, energy isn't necessarily the only measure of what's a civilization. It's a measure of energy. And it doesn't necessarily tell us about culture, how that energy is used, what's accomplished for it. Again, as was brought up, the efficiency of it, the negative impacts of it. Using more energy may be something that's the opposite of civilization, as we will see. So it was a way, I think it satisfied the urge for anthropologists to be able to put a number on something, to get away from that subjective scaling that we saw with Murdoch and Creighton and Child, to try and put some hard and fast, hard science to the social science of anthropology, to understanding humans. There's this urge in science to want to make it like physics or math or chemistry, that humans should operate the same way. With the advent of Darwin, we accept that we are just another animal on the planet, that we're subject to the same rules of physics that everything else is on the planet, and therefore we should be able to be quantified, calculated, understood on hard terms. But the reality is that we're not like other matter in the universe. So just expanding on that a little bit more, Nikolai Kardashev was a cosmonaut from Russia who was looking at extraterrestrials and wondering, what are we dealing with if we think about extraterrestrial civilizations? What type of civilizations might there be out in space? And he used a very coarse scale. And just like we were saying that maybe Earth needs to be considered as one civilization now. So his type 1, and again, he's using energetics, so he's looking at the amount of energy being harnessed by these civilizations. So type 1, using 10 to the 16th watts of energy, he calculates that to be the amount of energy that would be produced and radiated from a planet. So a civilization like Earth, where the civilization is contained within one planet. A type 2 goes up to 10 to 26 watts of energy, a phenomenal amount of energy. Now he's looking at an entire solar system being harnessed by this civilization, where they're on multiple planets, and they are sending out signals into space, radiation into space, just like the Earth does, that would suggest that they control or working together in the uniform production of energy within an entire solar system. And then he moves to the galaxy, the a phenomenally large concept of a civilization, the stuff from Star Wars or Star Trek, this vast intergalactic, or well, not intergalactic, but galactic civilization producing 10 to the 36 watts of energy, or type 3. So his scale became adopted by the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, the SETI program. And so when we look to try to find signals that are not produced by nature out in the universe, that we try to look at the dimensions of those signals, and if we find them, that will at least have some concept of the type of civilization that we would be looking at from space. So we've got some ideas on how we can think of civilization. How did civilization come about? What are the origins of civilization, the evolution of social complexity? It's really phenomenal if you think about the fact that it wasn't but a few thousand years ago that this is how we lived, that we were hunters and gatherers with simple stone tools, living in very primitive social organizations, a family unit, extended family unit, or a band, very low impact. It wasn't that long ago for humanity to live like that. Within a few thousand years of the end of the Ice Age, we had cities like Rome growing up around the world. And so you had this phenomenal transference of the whole state of humanity. There were still people who were hunter-gatherers living in very simple levels of society with simple levels of subsistence, simple levels of energy harnessing. But you also had cities like Rome appearing, not that many of them, but smaller ones, appearing around the globe in various times. Oftentimes growing up independently from each other. It wasn't that one started it and then everyone else copied it, that humans came up with different ways to develop these types of civilizations until we arrived to this highest level of civilization where we're at now. So you can see how we've gone from that very simple lifestyle to this very energy dependent, complex lifestyle. It's the evolution of civilization, the progress of humanity in our social, political, technological, and economic ways. So where did we go wrong? Because when you think about how it looks, I think a lot of us dream of going on a vacation where we can just camp out in the woods and live in a low intense, low stress situation where we're not damaging our planet and destroying it, more every day. So we've followed down this course of civilization, but was it really progress? Was it something that was good? Hold on a sec. Thoughts on the concept of civilization when we think about where we were and where we are now? Are you, as the next generation, happy with the civilization that you're inheriting?
I think that is a coin with two sides. So on the one hand, we have really good progress in technologies, for instance, and right now we can learn online from our home. But at the same time, we can look at like psychological states and what Freud would say about our our stresses, because we now depend on civilization, or at ecological problems.
Right. Yeah, it's a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, we have these incredible feats of technology, these feats of accomplishment, these opportunities for diversification, for learning. On the other hand, we're destroying our planet. We're creating high levels of stress, interpersonal stress, high levels of violence, competition for resources. So yeah, definitely there are two sides to that. As we think about how societies evolve, we're going to want to be thinking in the weeks to come how they devolve. What are the factors that start to tear them down? Are we witnessing some of those in our society now? Just watch this for a minute or so, just to watch how human population has changed on Earth. Watch what happens with the Neolithic when farming is invented. So, what does that tell us about humanity? Have we been successful in building civilization?
It was up to this moment.
We've been quite successful. The big jump first coming with the advent of farming, the second one coming with industrialization and modern medicine, the nation states in supporting a big population, of making our species very successful in our demographic growth.
Jay, I have a question.
Yeah.
About population. So why we don't really have decreasing of population after bubonic plague and world wars? I mean, like a lot of people dies in one period of time, but we still have this increasing of population.
Yeah, and you'll notice that when the bubonic plague hit, there was a slight dip in the population curve, a very slow dip in leveling, because again, we're looking at the whole world population. And the thing is that humanity and a lot of species can suffer pretty dramatic damage to our population and recover very quickly within a generation. So just like the Russian population was decimated in World War II, particularly of men, yet Russia rebounded very quickly, as we saw in the 1950s, both in America and Germany and Japan and other places, even though a significant portion of the male, let's say mostly the male population, World War II, I think a little more balanced out as far as women and children also being killed. But people are fecundity, our ability to reproduce, goes up quite a bit. We can be quite prolific in creating children. In the post-World War I, years, my mother's family had 12 children. My family, after World War II, had 5 children. I have 3. I don't know if any of my children will decide to ever have children. It could be that they have 0 at this point. So yeah, you see that the amount of children that we have can adjust very quickly to circumstances. And regionally, you'll find things like cultural behavior will change. Age of marriage can go up or down. Right now, age of marriage tends to be moving up. People aren't getting married till 30 or 40 or even later in life now. For economic reasons, for choice reasons, for various reasons. During the potato famine in Ireland, the age of marriage went up considerably. People had less children. They wouldn't get married and have children. There wasn't enough food for people. That can also be reflected biologically in nutritional issues or stress. When you're under a lot of stress, you're less likely to reproduce for both psychological and biological reasons. So populations can respond pretty well to these little dips that might happen for something like the bubonic plague, which covers, it really impacts one generation or a world war or a regional famine, something like that. It doesn't take long for in nature and ecological situations, which you'll see something called adaptive radiation, where if there's an animal that has a niche, it has a particular type of food that it likes and there's no competition for that food, that animal will reproduce very quickly and fill up as much of the territory to take advantage of that ecological niche as possible. And then other things will start to respond to it. Predators or something like that will then begin to hunt them because they're in abundance. And so nature will tend to regulate itself. Humans, we work outside of these natural laws for the most part, with a few exceptions, such as the virus going around now, so that we're not as subject to the forces of nature that we mastered overcoming those. But we still have those abilities, such as to increase our population very quickly in the right circumstances. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, there were drops. If you look at the percentage of population that were killed in World War I or World War II, for the total global population, it's still not enormous. In certain regions, it was devastating, of course. Same thing with the Mongols going across, Asia. There were areas that were left depopulated afterwards. But when humans come into a place like that, it's like having an open niche in nature for another animal that we will reproduce and fill that niche very quickly, both sometimes through immigration, but also just through fecundity, through having children. Oops. Come on. Okay, so as we consider the evolution of societies, I want to introduce Christian Thompson, who is the one who solidified the terms of Stone Age and Bronze Age and Iron Age. Because we use those, I think it's important to understand where those terms came from. So he was the curator of the Royal Danish Museum, in charge of collections, and he used this age system for cataloging the artifacts in the museum. So that 3H system became fixed in our psyche. And as we saw when we were talking about Lewis Henry Morgan's use of technology for evaluating societies, that he was very fixated on that as well. And so if you were using bronze, then you could not be, above middle barbarism in the scale of complexity in civilizations. So, which we know isn't the case, and even as the statistics were showing in Creighton's analysis, that there weren't necessarily one thing that you could say this was the hallmark of civilization in those categories that he was using. Nonetheless, the scale of Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Stone Age being divided into the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. Lithic meaning stone, Paleo old, Neo new. So we have the Old Stone Age and the New Stone Age. Sometimes people throw in the Chalcolithic after the Neolithic. That's the introduction of copper being used as a standard metal, and then into the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. So the time period that we want to look at, not the time period, but the epoch of technological, socio-technological evolution that we want to look at is this period that starts with the Neolithic. So you have the retreat of glaciers, and you begin to see humans figuring out how to farm. Now, as I mentioned before, there are humans figuring out different types of farming in various types of the world. So this isn't a matter of cultural diffusion. This is a matter of autochthonous development, where humans are, by our nature, able to figure out, that plants grow, and then how to control that, to domesticate those plants, and to begin to change and develop a relationship with those plants, where those plants will begin to be selected according to our desires, the attributes that we want for them, as far as being able to harvest them, the amount of calories that they're producing, the taste that they might have. And so if you look at this map, you can see that agriculture was developed at different times in different places in the world. So we see it really early examples over in China along the Yellow River. I picked a bad map. This doesn't show India. So in India, in the Indus River Valley, in Mesopotamia, so just the southern part of Anatolia down into Syria and Iraq. We see it in Africa. We see it in North America, in Mesoamerica, and in South America, and also in the circum-Pacific area. The one highlighted down at the bottom there, just above Australia and Papua New Guinea. Within the last 30 years, we've been finding some archaeological evidence that's showing extremely early agricultural evidence, including shovels, wooden shovels preserved for 10,000 years, where they were draining swamps to do yam production. So we still are discovering places. So it wouldn't surprise me that this map should not be viewed as the end all as far as what we're going to discover. And you know, as we're having glaciers retreat, and we're making all sorts of new discoveries as well. But these are the main areas where we see the relationship between humans and plants begin to develop that leads us to fairly intensive agricultural practices. So again, farming is associated with the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, so that as people are beginning to farm, the tools that they're using are stone tools still. So who knows what obsidian is? All right, what's obsidian?
It's a volcanic glass. Like when lava dries up, it's like it stays in place of it, or something like that.
Yeah, it's a product from a volcano, a particular mineral compound that is indeed glass, and so it's an extremely sharp tool that can be worked to make very fine blades and points, sharper than you can make steel. When you make an obsidian edge, when you break a piece of obsidian and you fracture it to make a blade, it's one molecule at the edge. So they've even done surgery with obsidian tools because it's better than steel. But the problem is, of course, is that it's also fragile, that it can break and splinter, and you don't want that with your blades. So,
could you please spell the word?
Spell obsidian?
Yeah.
OBSIDIAN.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So we're going to focus a lot on southern Anatolia, right, around the area of Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent area. And there were obsidian sources there, and those that obsidian was traded throughout the Middle East. And so that's going to be important also when we talk about what are the factors that promote the development of complex societies. So again, just looking at the Southwest Asia and Asia areas, the development of agriculture and domestication, you see it beginning around 15,000 years BP. And everybody knows what BP stands for, right? Before present. So different than BC or BCE, which is before Christ or before the Common Era, which one is more, we use BCE in science usually because it doesn't carry the religious connotations. But it recognizes that, you know, in the common parlance that we recognize 0, 1 AD is the beginning of a new way of measuring time. So, so if you see BCE, before the Common Era, just figure that you've got to adjust it by 2020 years if you're comparing that to before present. So if we talk about 15,000 BP, when we start to see some pottery, some homes being built, that we're talking about 13,000 years ago. So by the time we get to about 10,000 BP, we're starting to see domestication of animals. We're starting to see domestication of crops. And so you're seeing that first to emerge, as the archaeological record tells us, in the Levant, in the Near East. So the Levant being Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, South China, North China, the Indus Valley, between the Ganges and the Indus River, the Indian Savannah and West Africa, later in history. And then, of course, if we looked at the New World, as we saw on that other map, that it takes off later in places like Mexico and South America. And we're seeing it beginning earlier now in places like Papua New Guinea. So the Fertile Crescent, named because it was this crescent shape where we see civilization beginning to really first coalesce in the world, where people are really making this transition from that hunter-gatherer mode that they had for the last 100,000 years before then, to now beginning to settle, beginning to have those fixed residences that were talked about in those charts, to begin to look at, to see the coalescence of ideology, of more complexity in social organizations, larger groups of people living together, beginnings of perhaps some sort of differentiation between those people, other than just gender-based or age-based. So it's really, this is where we're seeing the seeds of civilization. You know, this is archaeologically, this is our laboratory for understanding what happened, how we made that transference from these primitive levels of society, or these simple levels of society, to begin on that path that has led us to where we are now. You'll pay particular attention over here to Çatalhöyük. Göbekli Tepe is in the news a lot now. So sometimes you'll see it, people are try to use the monuments there because there's a large religious site there that was buried. So people try to use it for the ancient aliens and things like that. But it's consistent with what's going on across the Fertile Crescent here in the early part of the Neolithic period. Another very important site, Chayinu. We're not going to talk about most of these because we're going to move on towards complexity. But let's take just a quick look at Çatalhöyük, which is probably one of the most famous Neolithic sites because the archaeology was done there early, and it really represented just a nice example of this really dramatic change that was going on in the way humans were living in the world. So you can see evidence of domestication, rather complex households with streets, artistic forms showing up, ritual burials under the house. Oftentimes you'll see a connection with ancestors. Here, if you look at what archaeologically, here you can see an area that suggests a high level of ritual practice. So with the horns. So you can see that you've got the basic elements of what we associate with civilization. Now, probably they didn't have a very hierarchical society. The economy was still largely based on herding and agriculture, but you're beginning to get some specialization as well. So you're seeing these very beginnings of these elements that child associated with civilization here in the settlement at Çatalhöyük. So some of the accomplishments that happened that humanity made, one, the domestication of animals, the domestication of the dog, it shows in this chart. Yeah, of course, that actually happened in the Paleolithic, but continues on into the Neolithic. You know, as you consider what's happened when those dogs or wolves first encountered humans and made an alliance to live with us and work with us, and how over the last several thousand years of breeding, what we've done to them, I would say that that's another species that has suffered from our progress, that dogs now aren't necessarily what they used to be. Not all, of course, but many of the breeds. One evolutionary scientist, I was listening to a lecture, and he was pointing out that if they had to revert back to the wild, a lot of the species of dogs that we have would not survive in the wild very long. So we have selected them, not for efficiency or anything else, but just for our own aesthetic cuteness that we wanted out of them. Of course, you see the domestication of plants and farming. And as is emphasized by many archaeologists, the invention of alcohol, drinking alcohol, beer in particular. So it was a great way to store grain and to store the calories of that grain. And of course, it became one of the mainstays of most civilizations, had some form of alcohol. Egypt was very famous for their beer. So the very primitive technology that we had, the grinding stones that would have been used probably in the Paleolithic for processing food that was gathered. But now you get to 6000 BCE, and you see the invention of the potter's wheel. So what does pottery tell us about how people were living?
Maybe start of some different activities, not just hunting and gathering.
Okay.
Like some part-time, maybe specialization.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly changed the way we cook, for one, but most importantly, what the pottery kind of allowed us to do was to be used for storage. So now you could store liquids and oils and food and grains in these pots for long periods of time. So as we began to stay in one place, you could have big pots used for storage. So it's indicative of this interaction going on where we're staying in one place, we're producing some surplus that we can then save for later, that we have storage going on. And then it also begins to represent artistically, a form of artistic expression as well. And then, of course, we begin to harness those animals, as Leslie White would talk about. Now we're getting more energy. When we harness those animals, we're harnessing their energy for our good. So now we're increasing our energy management capacity. When we start harnessing animals, we're able to intensify our agricultural production, increase our surplus. Less people have to be involved in farming, which means more people can be involved in doing other things. So we're seeing these technologies that are feeding right back into every other aspect of society, leading to this spiral of complexity. Because remember, we went over 100,000 years in a very simple way of life, and now we hit 10,000 years before present, have agriculture going, and now within a couple of thousand years, we're seeing the beginnings of cities appear. And within very few thousand years, we have full civilizations and empires evolving. So the pace of development of humanity takes off in the Neolithic, and of course it's continued on with a few ups and downs, but it's continued on into the modern time, continuing at, just like we saw with those demographic curves, that with the beginning with the Neolithic, it's gone on with every other aspect of what we associate with complex society. So just again, looking at a timeline from the Levant, 7,000 years before Christ, before the Common Era, you have the development of, well, you have the first beginnings of urban settlements, like the city of Jericho, where they're using skulls and there's rituals, there's walls being built and towers. You have the earliest cities by 5,000 BC. We saw the pottery wheel, so you're having mass production of pottery going on. By 4,000, you have the first bronze being cast. So people are specializing, they're working with copper first, and then they're mixing the copper with either tin or arsenic to create bronze. So they've got this new metal technology that takes off and becomes the main technology for tools and weapons. You see the beginnings by 3,500. You see the first ziggurats, the White Temple at Uruk. So you see these massive religious pyramids being built. So these big religious constructions that show this very centralized ideological and socio-political power within these now states. By 3,300, you have cuneiform, right? The first real writing system. This has the potter's wheel a little bit later than the other chart. Again, development of these religious ideas. By 1758, we have the law of Hammurabi. What does that tell us when you have a law code being written out like that? Is that something you would expect from a low level of social political organization, or does that suggest that you've got a bureaucracy now, you've got people, you're having to regulate a large population, so you're having to create laws that help guide people in understanding that there are consequences for negative behavior within the society, and that those are standardized, that people expect things to be equal, so that there has to be a law that spells that out. So yeah, it's a huge jump up in the psychology of humans living within a group. And then of course you have an increase in fortified cities, more competition between these state levels. It has the Epic of Gilgamesh there, so there you're beginning to see this mythology codified, both to tell moral lessons, but also creating, in essence, a kind of a mythos, a cultural mythos and identity, so that people could say, we are the descendants of Gilgamesh, of the great king Gilgamesh, who built the walls of Uruk and who accomplished all these things. And so it becomes part of your national identity. So again, looking in the Fertile Crescent. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I have a question for the previous slides. So we can see that before the Christ was born, we had a lot of civilization, and also after, and there is thousands years of human civilization, and we can see how social structure was very developed. I mean, in a case of laws and social structure, but why we have so late, development of technologies? I mean, like, I just trying to explain so why we have, why only now and so recently we have very advanced technologies and industrial revolution, but all this time when people do something, we had nothing.
Well, they had technology, but technology is something that grows because of the feedback with other technology and also a state of mind. So, I mean, you couldn't, I mean, if I understand what you're saying is, why didn't they just start with iron? Why didn't they get to iron at 2500 BC instead of waiting until 1000 BC before we enter the Iron Age? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, also, I mean, that's why it takes so long before the Industrial Revolution. And then we have a very high gap of technologies. And we saw the level of population in a previous video where it's, like more like a plateau, like constant number, and then really.
Yeah, there's an accumulation of variables going on, and at a certain point, those variables, as people accumulate knowledge, that it can lead to a dramatic change in your circumstances. One of the problems I think that we have in history and science, and particularly in the study of evolution, is that we tend to think that all the laws are always the same. But the reality is that the laws change in the universe, and that we work under different sets of circumstances and parameters under those changes. So if you think about the origins of the Earth, go back, 4.5 billion years ago, and before there's life on Earth, before there's organic compounds on Earth, yet within that matrix of Earth was the ability for these organic compounds to form and to eventually create DNA. As soon as that DNA appeared on the scene, the rules were all different now. Things could exist in the universe that never existed before once you had DNA. And then as the DNA developed in sexual reproduction, so they could share DNA. And so it increased the rate of mutation and the ability for variation and adaptability. And so you have life radiating throughout the planet. You have photosynthesis happening, right? The first eukaryotic cells that developed photosynthesis, where they could float in the ocean in big mats of algae that would take the sun and generate oxygen. So now the universe, the world changed because the atmosphere became oxygenated. So now that opened up new opportunities for life to get up on land and to begin to breathe air. And so the rules were kept changing. And then when you had human intelligence evolve, the rules changed again. Things could happen in the universe that never happened before. So when Darwin wrote in the 1860s, and one of his good friends, Charles Lyell, the father of geology, had written about the principle of uniformitarianism, saying that the world was old. I can tell it's old because things like giant canyons, we don't have to think that those were created in the world as they are now, that God didn't just create the world and say, I'll put a canyon here. But I could look at that river that's now just a trickle running down the bottom of that canyon and imagine the uniform forces that I can see of erosion occurring over hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years, shaping that canyon. So he came up with the principle of uniformitarianism, this idea that the laws are the same and we can see them work over time gradually. Darwin used that same principle. He's saying, well, look, the same thing applies to biological species, that we can follow those same rules and that things will change over time through little accumulations of changes, that we can move from one species to another species. But the rules do change. And so I think it's led us astray in our understanding of evolution to think, we tend to want to think that things are uniform. But particularly with the human ability to harness knowledge and information, and again, this is for another class really, but that the ability, once humans began to use symbolic communication, to store knowledge, to share knowledge, to make our brains more efficient, to reprogram ourselves, right? So I can't remember everything, but I can look it up in a book. Now I can look it up on the web. So I've expanded the biological limitations of my brain by being able to have access to this other knowledge. And that's what we've mastered. And that's what we began mastering in the Neolithic period. We began writing. As soon as we began writing, those tales of Gilgamesh, the tales of, or the laws of Hammurabi, we began programming ourselves and accumulating knowledge that could be used in the future by other humans, who then take the knowledge that they have, bring in these other bits of knowledge, and it allows for increased innovation and increased imagination. A lot of times when we think of evolution, we don't think of it in terms of imagination, but imagination is how we progress. And so when you look at the development of technology, it follows that same sort of logarithmic scale that you see with demographics and complexity. That technology, maybe even more so, it builds. And we hit snags. The Library of Alexandria was destroyed and a lot of our learning was lost. But we pick it up again, and we pick up better than than where we were when we started before that. And so humanity is able to keep accumulating these things, and we're so good at it. And the internet, the fact that we're doing this now, is really the epitome of taking all that knowledge of humanity, and you now have it on your telephone. I mean, you can't imagine what it was like 30 or 40 years ago, the hours you would spend in the library trying to find what you can Google without even thinking about it, just for fun. So we master the ability to harness not energy, and this is where I think Leslie White was wrong. What we manage to harness is knowledge, and that knowledge then allows us to change reality. We can alter the universe. We can create elements that can't exist in nature, Einsteinium, for instance. So when you think about the trajectory of the advancement of technology, it's that process of collecting information, of harnessing that information, of trying to become efficient in using that information, applying our imagination and innovation to it, so that now you have access to exponentially more, almost everything that humanity has learned over the last 10,000 years, you have at your fingertips. And that's pretty amazing when you think about it. And so when you look at the technological accomplishments that we do now, this virus comes out. January 10th, I believe the Chinese had already sequenced the RNA sequence for the virus. We knew every chemical that went into its manufacture. We knew its entire metabolism. Now we're trying to figure out how to use that information to fight against it, to teach our bodies to destroy it. But yeah, we went down to chemicals when Darwin, just a few hundred years ago, 1860, not even 200 years ago, imagined evolution. He could have never imagined DNA as the mechanism of that evolution. He had no idea what was going on with it. So yeah, just within this few hundred years, we've made these incredible advances that we can reprogram DNA. So yeah, technology. It seems like it's kind of a slow drag for humanity through the technology as we, as they began working with copper, and then someone stumbled on the idea of bronze, and then from bronze to iron, and eventually you start to get the mentality of, okay, what can I do now? After you may find something first by accident, like the first agriculture was probably, oh, I dropped all these seeds here and they're growing again, kind of an accident. And then we're very good about then exploiting that to domesticate and to harness and to control those things. That became part of our nature because evolution selected for us to be able to anticipate into the future and try to be better about preparing our survival to go on. And that tool that evolution gave us, we've expanded into everything, maybe to the point of destroying ourselves even. So long answer to your question. I don't know if it satisfied you on that, Daria?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So what we saw before in the Fertile Crescent with Çatalhöyük and Çayunu, these towns that grew up, these settlements. Now what we see as we get into the fourth millennia BC or BCE, we begin to see these states and even empires begin to grow. So people are solidifying and enhancing their settlements. They're building larger ritual structures. They're competing with each other in warfare on a regular basis. They're fortifying their cities now. They're conquering each other and demanding tribute. And so you look at some of the major civilizations that start to grow up here. You have the Canaanites, of course, on the Nile River. The Egyptian civilization is really taking off by the end of the fourth millennia. Babylonia, Sumer, where the Sumerians really, where it kind of really first takes off in the Fertile Crescent as far as complex societies. And so Mesopotamia becomes the seat of all this land between the two rivers, between the Euphrates and between the Tigris. Just some examples from Uruk, and there's the main ziggurat, right, the main pyramid of the city of Uruk, and then a computer reconstruction of it. You can see, compare that to what you saw in Çatalhöyük a few thousand years before. It's a much higher level of complexity, much more surplus labor going into constructing these edifices, these ritual structures that aren't just for living, but these are now for very ritual and symbolic purposes. So we begin to see these empires as we move on into the third millennia and the second millennia. We begin to see these very large states and empires begin. So this map shows around 1350 BC, so in the middle of the second millennia, and you see in Turkey with the capital at Hattusis, the Hittite Empire, the Mitanni right nearby. You have the Egyptians, Babylonians. And so you're seeing these mega states, these very large states appear. So at this point, you can imagine that the amount of surplus being generated through agriculture is enormous because you have very large amounts of population that are doing things other than agriculture. When I say large amounts in a society like these, that we might be talking 10 or 15% of the population that's not involved in food production. Nowadays, it's the reverse, right? You expect maybe 10 or 15% of the population involved in food production because we've industrialized our farming. So here we're still using, the farming techniques, but we've got, irrigation has been mastered at this point. And so all these societies are using irrigated fields. They're taking advantage of the floods and the fertility offered by the river valleys that they're associated with. So intensified agriculture is going on, and everything, a lot of what we consider the epitome, the high points of civilization is appearing at this point in history. We're down to a few minutes, aren't we here? Okay, just to go through real quick, looking at Egypt as an example, here at 3100 BC, we have the Palette of Narmer. That was a document, it was a commemorative palette, just a stone that was carved. You can see it in the British Museum. No, you can see it in the Egyptian Museum. That was Narmer conquered Lower Egypt, the northern part of Egypt. Upper Egypt is the south, because that's the direction the Nile flows from. Lower Egypt is the delta. So he conquered Lower Egypt and united Egypt into one state, the Egypt that we think of. So that begins around 3100 BC. By the time we get to 2500 BC, we're in the Old Kingdom. We have things like the Sphinx and the Great Pyramids being built. And then you go on, by the time you get to 1200 BC, you have the beginnings of the Jewish religion coming out of Egypt. It kind of solidifies it with the exodus out of Egypt. And so you see that these developmental processes are now picking up pace. Again, it wasn't but a few thousand years ago that we were all hunters and gatherers. Now you have people living in these giant imperial kingdoms that are fighting wars with each other, that are creating monuments that stand today as tributes to what humanity can accomplish. So looking at the elements of civilization, again, that we're seeing that are common to civilization: cities, government, religion, social classes, writing, culture, and job specialization. I think I'm gonna, let's see. All right, we got a few minutes, so I'll try to get through this. So what causes humans to create these complex societies? So Herbert Spencer, one of the father of anthropology, really, the study of humanity, he thought that it was a process of integration, that humans living with each other as we began to develop a cultural identity, that we naturally socialized, and then that fed into complexity. Not a particularly satisfying answer. Emil Durkheim expounded on that concept, and he looked at the concept of solidarity. Why do we stay together as a nation? Why do people associate with each other? And so he broke it down to two types of solidarity: mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. So in the words of Durkheim, society can survive only if there exists among its members a sufficient degree of homogeneity. Education perpetuates and reinforces this homogeneity by fixing in the mind of the child from the beginning the essential similarities that social life demands. We're born being indoctrinated into the society that we live in. That's what our parents do. That's what our schools do. That's what all of our institutions do. That's what the symbols that you see, the entertainment that you experience. So we're building a sense of belonging to a group. And that, I think, is absolutely right, that is a fundamental element of what makes us part of a society. And that togetherness allows us then to accomplish the aspects of complexity and to accept the authority that comes with building a more complex society. So again, looking at that mechanical solidarity, that's that natural solidarity. It's just the mechanism that happens when you grow up as part of a family. It's based on kinship. It's something that's always there. Even in a complex society, we still use mechanical solidarity. Most of you are probably at your parents' house now and have a certain degree of respect, at least, if not fondness, for your parents. Organic solidarity, on the other hand, this is what he sees as being superimposed on top of us. This is what comes at social integration that arises out of the interdependence of the members of a society. You have a certain amount of solidarity with the guy or gal working at the store when you say hello and you buy products from that person. There's a certain recognition of a shared culture. You're going to give them money. They're going to give you some things. It's understood. There's an honor and trust system going on there. There's this imposition of unity that people share, not because we were born together, but because we share this aspect of economy, of politics, of appreciation of art, of social media, whatever it might be that draws us together outside of what those natural things that would happen in a hunter-gatherer family, living 10,000 years ago. These are things that come and allow us to belong to part of a much larger, much more complex society. In opposition to that idea is the recognition that we have integration, but we also have what Durkheim would call anomy. It's the condition that occurs when you don't fit into that society, when you feel pushed out of that society, when you don't belong, and psychologically that you have not meshed, or something has driven you away from that society. So when you think about what happens often in America, but I see this also happens here in Russia, just happened in Canada, when someone goes nuts and shoots up a bunch of people, something's gone on with that person where they didn't feel any fellowship to their fellow Canadians or Americans or Russians, that they felt it was okay, or an expression of their anger or frustration or psychological disassociation with society to just kill people. So I think as a concept, it's important to understand the solidarity that Durkheim's talking about. But when we start thinking about what might degrade a society and what might cause dissolution of a society, obviously that solidarity has to be broken in some way. And so this is an important concept, I think, to think about when we think about the collapse of complex societies. And we'll call it a night with that. Any questions? I'll stay on for another 10 minutes or so or longer if people have questions or want to discuss any topics. Otherwise, for my class, you're free to go. For those of you who might be watching and streaming on YouTube, thank you. Appreciate your attention. And if you have questions, you can go ahead and send them to the chat and they'll be relayed over to me. So again, thank you. Do svidaniya. Good night. Spokojnej noche.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Jay. The last part was very interesting.
Good, good.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Good night.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Bye. We'll see you tomorrow for group work. You still there?